Today we're interviewing Colonel Frank Connell and through the Veterans History Project, which was created by Congress in 2000, and it's for the Fairhope Library archives for our future generations. So what I need to do, Colonel, is start off with your...
I was born in Norwalk, Connecticut. My father at the time was working in New York City as a sugar broker on Wall Street. When I was 12, we moved to Florida, South Florida, and when I was 16, I got lucky and moved to beautiful Fairhope, Alabama. I graduated from Fairhope High School, then I attended the University of Alabama and graduated from there in 1958, and concurrently got an ROTC commission as I had gone through advanced ROTC as a second lieutenant. I entered active duty in January 1959 at Fort Lee, Virginia. I was in the Quartermaster Corps. Quartermaster basically have to do with primarily with supply, but there's some maintenance involved too. Maintenance was always the thing I liked, I might add. After serving a year at Fort Lee, I was assigned to Germany, where I stayed. I was assigned first to the 14th Armored Cavalry, which was in Fulda, Germany. And for my last year of the 3.5-year tour, I spent in Weilflecken, Germany. From Weilflecken, I came back to Fort Lee, went to the officers' advanced course, which is for captains. By that time, I had been promoted to captain. And upon completing that course, was assigned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. After I'd been there working in the as an S4, which is a supplied staff job, for 3 months, I got really fortunate and was assigned the company commander of what was then B Company of the 34th Quartermaster Battalion. Approximately 10 months later, it would have been June of 1965, we were alerted that we would be deploying to South Vietnam. My year as the company commander was almost up, and generally you only get 1 year. Fortunately, I was able to convince my bosses that since I had trained this unit and had been with them that time, they needed a trained staff to do the job in Vietnam, and so I was allowed to keep the company. In preparation for going overseas, that was quite interesting because, first of all, we were under strength, as most units in the United States are. So they had to bring us up to strength both equipment-wise and personnel-wise. And they had to do it quickly, and at the same time, we had to pack out to have our stuff shipped via sea to Vietnam. And at that time, of course, we had no idea where in Vietnam we were going, other than it was Vietnam and it was hot. That's about all we knew about Vietnam. Anyway, the first interesting thing that happened was in the personnel selection, what happens is when one company is told they have to ship personnel to another unit to bring them up to strength, they generally don't take their best soldiers. In other words, you get the bottom of the barrel. It was interesting, one day I received 13 Puerto Rican soldiers, U.S. Army, but Puerto Rican descent, whose English in all 13 of them was not very good. Our initial inclination was to say, we just can't use them. But I talked to the first sergeant, and he and I decided, let's take a little deeper look at these kids. Anyway, we learned, amazingly, that when these gentlemen entered the Army in Puerto Rico, they were given the Army aptitude test in English. And Spanish was not an option for them, yet their mother language was Spanish. Hence, these Puerto Ricans all did extremely poor on the aptitude test, and they showed no general aptitude for anything. To me, that didn't make a lot of sense. So in delving a little deeper, I found that 4 of them actually had been to college. None of them had graduated yet, but one of them had as many, 2 of them I think had 2 years college, and the other 2 I believe had 1 year of college. So to me, that means they weren't particularly stupid. Well, what this aptitude test means, to go back for a second, is that if you don't do well in this thing, you don't get advanced training in many cases, and you're just assigned as what they call a duty soldier to some unit that just, and your chances of advancement and everything are almost nil. Well, out of the 13, in checking deeply, we found 3 of them were troublemakers, and we rejected 3 of them. We kept the other 10. Now, to get ahead of myself, of those 10, all of them got promoted at least once in Vietnam. One of them got promoted 3 times. He was an outstanding soldier. I kept up with him. He retired about 4 years after I did. So of all the achievements I did in the Army, I think I'm probably most proud of that, in that we were able to resurrect these 10 young men from, to make them good soldiers, productive for the U.S. Army. The next thing, okay, then we packed up our equipment. They flew us from Pope Air Force Base, adjacent to Fort Bragg, to Oakland, California, where we got on this old World War II troop ship called the El Tinge, and embarked, or debarked, I guess it is, for Vietnam. While we were in Oakland, still, we thought we spotted our equipment on a ship nearby being loaded in, and I made note of that name of that ship, which will come up later. So anyway, our cruise across the ocean was long, not just very boring, and we all were just couldn't wait to get off that ship. Combat or no combat, it's got to be better than this ship. None of us were Navy men, that was for sure. So after about 17 days, our ship ran into some sort of problem, and they had to pull in a port at Guam, and we stayed there for 2 days as they repaired the ship. And that didn't turn out so good either, because when we left, we had to go through the Philippine Straits, and we got the tail end of a typhoon. So hence all the troops that were sleeping below decks got very sick, and it was a very unpleasant experience. I mean, the smell alone could just keep you from eating for several days. It was bad. But finally we got to Vietnam, and the first port was a place called Quy Nhon, which is north and south from Vietnam, is about in the middle. And I had been bunking on the way across with a captain, an ordnance captain, who had an ammunition company commander of an ammunition unit. We had hit it off pretty well, and we decided we'd try to keep in touch once we got into Vietnam. I'll come back again to that in a little bit. So the second port was Camron Bay. Beautiful, beautiful bay, beautiful sand, clear water. We looked off the ship and you could see all these great big sharks flying around, but it was a deep port. It was just a natural port, which is why the military had selected it. But there was nothing there at that time, and we were building the facilities as we landed, and we were part of that building process along with the engineers. So once we got there, our equipment wasn't there, wasn't due in for another 2 or 3 weeks. So we spent the early days preparing our company area where we lived. One of the first things we found out is the Army doesn't provide you tents to live in. They provide you tents to work for your workplace, but not to live in. And we were expected to live in tents. We do have a pup tent, but a pup tent in Vietnam during the monsoon season is not where you want to be, because that rain comes down, and I'm telling you what, you get wet. Now my advanced party had set up they had gotten a hold of 2 tents, and they said one was from the officers and senior enlisted to sleep in, and all our troops would sleep in pup tents, and the other one was for our equipment, our duffel bags and the like. And I said, no, we're not going to do that. If one man in this company sleeps in a pup tent, we're all going to sleep in pup tents, because that way we're all going to be motivated to getting tents, proper tentage for all of us. And that was between the first sergeant and myself, that was probably the smartest move we made, because we did get tents far quicker than any other unit around there. We had tents in 3 days. So we spent 3 nights in pup tents, one of which was a monsoon downpour. And we said, this just ain't going to get it. So anyway, we were able to get our tentage by dealing with the U.S. Air Force. They were right up the road from us, and they were building their air base. So that was the initial thing. We set up the area and had a real nice area, and I have some photos of that area to show you. And we all lived in the company area. The officers and the NCO and key NCOs had their own little quarters, little tentage off to one side, but we were still in the same area. Well, after 3 weeks and our equipment was due, I had been checking all this time on the status of the equipment, and I found that the name of the ship that I had noted when I was in Oakland, California, was in Quinyon, where we had initially landed. And checking the reports I could get through the transportation people, that ship was due to leave Quinyon in 2 days and go to Okinawa with what they said was PX equipment, and from there back to the States. And I said, well, that's not good, because my equipment's supposed to be on that ship. So I flew up to Quinyon, found my ordnance buddy, captain, and he got me to meeting the right people. I met this transportation lieutenant colonel who was in charge of the port, and he told me, no, you don't need to go out there, we'll check, and because they're leaving tomorrow. And I said, no, that's not going to work. So he didn't tell me I couldn't go out, but he said I shouldn't be, just let them handle it. But I went down there and I decided, no, I'm not going to let them handle it. So I was able to get one of those little LST things that they were using. They call them ducks, to unload the equipment from the ship to this little dock, and then they take it to shore because they didn't have piers for all the ships. So I got a ride out there, found the ship. They had a Greek crew. The Greeks weren't going to let me on board. After much cajoling and dealing with cigarettes and whatever,
Right.
I was able to get on board ship and look down into the holes, and sure enough, there was my equipment. So I have to go back to that lieutenant colonel who already told me not to go out there and tell him my equipment's in that ship, sir, and it needs to go to Camron Bay when it leaves here tomorrow, not Okinawa. And he was not happy. And he sent somebody out there to double check and found out I was right. And I said, yeah, I know I'm right, sir.
Yeah.
My eyes do work. So a few days later, we got our equipment. And once we got our equipment, we got set up, and things went real well. I should back up a little bit. I had a very motivated company in that they had deployed from Fort Lee, Virginia in 1962 during the Berlin crisis to Kaiserslautern.
Okay.
They were there about 18 months, and from there they deployed back to the States to Fort Bragg, where a little less than a year later I became the company commander. So all of the cadre, the key NCOs,
Right.
had been with the company for quite a while, and none of them were going to be sent anywhere because they had already had an overseas assignment. So we all went to Vietnam. So we had a very trained unit. The most valuable guy I had was my first sergeant, First Sergeant Lester Vance from New Jersey. It was interesting because he was black. Here I was, a University of Alabama graduate in 1964, right after we had the incident there with George Wallace at the doors of Foster Auditorium at the University of Alabama. But Vance and I, we hit it off. We were like, believe it or not, we were like brothers. We just thought so much alike. And so, he'd take care of the small problems, and if it was a big problem, he'd turn it over to me, and I just let him handle the small stuff. And then we discussed the big stuff and took it from there. And so anyway, he was invaluable. I had a very large company. It was actually a general support unit. General support meaning we don't go to the customer has to come to us because we don't have the mobility to go out into the field. When we got to Vietnam, they wanted us to be a direct support unit. I said, well, I'd love to do it, but you're going to have to give me a lot more transportation than what I got because we can't do it. We're not set up that way. Anyway, my lieutenants were all fairly young, but I had number of very good lieutenants. And I just want to look at my paper here for a second and refer, so I don't forget their names. Lieutenant Bruce Archinall was a graduate of Ohio State. He was my maintenance officer. Lieutenant Sonny Jones was from Kentucky, from Bowling Green University. Cooper Agent did my laundry platoon. He was a University of Kansas graduate. Vernon Lucy, who was probably my #1 lieutenant overall, was a Virginia Tech grad from Richmond, Virginia. George Francis was a Texan, had gone to Prairie View A&M, and Bob Soule was an Oklahoma Sooner graduate. He was my repair parts guy. And then I had another unique situation in that I commanded the only unit supposedly in the U.S. Army that had airborne troops, of which the company commander was not airborne. I had a parachute packing section, which is headed up by a warrant officer, John Palmer, from Stamford, Connecticut, and 14 enlisted personnel under him. And their job basically was to repair and pack parachutes. And if you know anything about parachute packing, the guys that pack it have to, without prior notice, they'll pull one off the shelf that he packed and you'll jump with it. So that kind of gives them a lot of motivation to make sure they do the job right. So anyway, so it's about a 320-man unit. Our principal job was maintenance of material handling equipment and refrigeration equipment, which you can imagine in a port with all these ships, forklifts were just invaluable. What the inventory the Army had at that time in forklifts were basically World War II stuff and just catch can, just a whole slew of things, none of which really worked out with no standardization, let's say. So repair parts were at a minimum. We focused on our job, and our job was to keep as many of those forklifts running as possible. Army regulations say you're not supposed to cannibalize, i.e., you're not supposed to take a part from one forklift that's broken to take another part from it to fix another one, to fix another forklift. Basically, you're supposed to let both forklifts down until you get the parts for them. We said common sense tells me that's not a good idea over here, and you can take all the parts you want off these forklifts to keep as many running as we can run. We'll document it to show where the part came from. We'll put in the requisitions as we should for the parts that were broken, but keep as many forklifts running as we can. We found out when we got inspected by the commanding general of the Army Territorial Command. He was a 3-star, I think, or maybe a 4-star. I really forgot now. But he came in, saw what we were doing, and poor my boss was scared to death that we were going to get really chewed out for what we did, this cannibalization. We got commended because he said, you have the highest operational rate of forklifts in this command in all of Vietnam, and you're the only one that's cannibalizing. So that's to me, common sense dictates, not some regulation that's written for somebody over in the United States. The other functions we had were we had to provide repair parts for all of those same items that we repaired, refrigeration and material handling being the primary two. And what I mean by the repair parts, we provided them to the unit so that they could do the unit level maintenance. Okay, so we had to come up with those too. And again, that was a problem because there just basically were no repair parts. Another thing I had, again in the maintenance area, which I guess I'm the proudest of, was I had an excellent machinist. And these guys figured out that there was a common used part for 2.5-ton truck that used in the axle that they could take, and the machinist could machine it down, make some modifications to it, and it would work on the forklifts. So we got a lot of parts. Mm-hmm. You know, we were requisitioning for truck parts, and they were wondering, what in the world are you doing all these truck parts? Well, we're fixing forklifts is what we're doing. But again, just having great people with a lot of initiative that we were able to keep things going. Other thing we had, which was a little bit of a problem, was a laundry platoon. The laundry platoon equipment, the washers and dryers, were all World War II stuff. And I think they had Willys engines that were, and there was no parts for those things. You couldn't keep them running. And so we really had a problem the first couple of weeks. But fortunately, in addition to having the laundry platoon, I also had a salvage platoon. A salvage platoon would take items that were no longer, were deemed unusable by the person who owned them, mostly the Air Force in this case, and they would turn them into us, and then we were supposed to get rid of them, backload them on ships, and send this stuff back to the States. But the Air Force had this, fortunately for us, they don't accept a lot of things that we would accept. If a shipping container was all banged up, they'd say, well, we don't want that. We send us some new ones. Of course, they got these big airplanes, and they can bring their stuff in fast, where we in the Army didn't have that luxury. Anyway, there were 2 great big generators that they turned into us for salvage. We immediately took those, looked at them. There was nothing wrong with them except the outside, the crating was broken, and there was a couple little dents in them. We started them up, used them, and what we then did is disconnect the Willys engines, use those big generators to power the laundry unit, and for the rest of our tour, we never had another maintenance problem with laundry units. All we had to do was take care of that generator. Our production, if you know what a T&E is, it's a table of equipment and authorization. And in there, they'll state what your capability is in terms of how many pounds of laundry you can do in a day. We more than doubled that because we worked, number one, we worked 2 shifts, and because the equipment never broke down. I mean, it just was great. Mm-hmm. We were doing laundry for the Air Force and the Special Forces guys on the other side of the bay, all of which we really weren't allegedly we were supposed to support, but they did things for us and we do things for them. You know, that's the way it works. If you want to get by, especially in a combat zone. So that worked well. Then another interesting area I had was graves registration. Graves registration has to do with the deceased, processing the remains and the personal property of deceased personnel. Well, Camron Bay wasn't in an active area where there was a lot of casualties, but Saigon had a mortuary, and so they said, well, we can use your troops down here. So we shipped them all down to Saigon, and they worked with the mortuary. And they did a real good job, but as is often the case in Army training, we found there was a glitch in that during their training back at Fort Lee, they were not allowed to handle dead bodies. And that was a state law. There was nothing the Army could do about that. It's just the way it was. And so they had never seen or handled dead bodies. Well, now they're in Vietnam, and they're getting dead bodies in like cordwood in some cases. I mean, it was awful at times. Hai Valley, I remember that one particularly because I happened to be in Saigon visiting the graves registration people at the time that they were bringing in the Hai Valley guys. If you remember that, that said Colonel Moore. Mm-hmm. That was just awful. That was, I guess, the first really big battle we had in Vietnam with the first Cav. And anyway, some of the troops just could not handle bodies, dead bodies. They just psychologically could not do it. And they weren't bad troops, they just couldn't do it. So we had to scurry around and find other guys that weren't trained in that in my company back at Camron, and we replaced these guys as we go along. We also sent a message back to Fort Lee and told them we're having problems because some of these guys can't handle the deceased. Now we would bring these guys back from Saigon and put them in a position back at Camron, and they all did fine. They were not troublemakers, not a single one of them. But that was a real problem that the Army had, and I guess still has, because how do you train somebody to handle dead bodies when they don't allow it? So, so that takes me to think. Okay, on the good side, I again was very, very blessed and fortunate Number one, I never got shot. I got shot at, but never hit. But in early December, I guess it was, I was called into the headquarters and told I was going to be the action officer for the Bob Hope show. He was coming to Camron Bay, and I was the guy that had to coordinate all that. That was fascinating. That was really fun, a great change of pace, and everything went well. We had the stage set up, the whole area where the troops were going to be, until about 5 o'clock the night before they came, and we got this message says, you got to get a canopy over the stage because the sun is just killing these performers. And I said, oh my goodness, how am I going to do that? Again, I go back to my parachute packing guys and the special forces that we were doing their laundry. We went to them. They gave us a bunch of used parachutes. We rigged them up over the stage. That night, we finished around midnight or so. We had it all done. They came in the next day. They complimented us how good it was, and whew.
Yeah.
And for me personally, it was great because I got to meet Bob Hope and all the various entertainers that were there. And let me see, some of them were I remember Carol Baker, who was a movie star. Yeah. Kay Stevens was a singer. Joey Jones was a singer. Joey Heatherton, who was a dancer and actress, I guess. She was Captain Kangaroo's daughter, I found out.
Oh.
Yeah. And and Anita Bryant was the other one. I remember them. So I got to meet all them, and so that was a great change of pace for me. And then it was back to work. About a month later, I got called in again and said, you did such a good job with the Bob Hope show, we got another job for you. What is it this time? Well, you get to escort Miss Texas for her 2-day visit to Camron Bay. So I had to find a place for her to stay, and we found a trailer where she could stay. And I did have set up some guards, around her little place there. And then I had to escort her all around for 2 days while she did her stuff around Camron. Well, while she was there, Life magazine came over and they did an article on it. And they took an aerial photo of her performing in Life magazine, a whole page photo. And I didn't know it at the time, but my sister later wrote me and sent me a copy of it while I was still in Vietnam. He said, oh, here's your photo. Where are you in this? And I said, oh, I'm right. And I could find myself. I'm right there.
Oh, okay.
So I was in that photo. So that was kind of interesting. Other than that, a couple of interesting things happened, not directly with me, but indirectly did affect me. We had a brand new Major General, a Brigadier General, had just been appointed Brigadier General, came over to Camron Bay, and he was told that his job was to expedite the completion of this depot that we were building for both repair and supply. And I guess he got a little carried away, because what happened is, in the Army, as a logistician, as one that supports the troops, our job is to provide what we call beans, bullets, and black oil. Beans being food, bullets meaning ammunition, black oil meaning fuel. That's our primary thing. Our whole reason for existing, for being in Vietnam, was to provide the combat fighter up front. That was why we were there. It wasn't for us. So, and the general, I'm afraid, kind of forgot that at some point, and he forgot to offload an ammunition ship which had some critical ammunition that a separate brigade right up the road needed. And as a result, after 3 weeks as a Brigadier General, he returned to the United States and was demoted to Colonel and retired, which was a sad story, but it certainly brought across the point. You better remember your mission: beans, bullets, black oil. Don't ever forget it. That's why we're there. And that was interesting. And I guess my last thing in Vietnam that was of notice was that 6 days, I think it was, before I returned to Vietnam, as we were returning from the hospital, was up at a place in the Trang, which was about 30, 40 miles up south of us, and some of that road was not very secure at times. And there was one particular place where they had a bridge and a bend, an S-curve right at the same spot. And as you came into that bridge, there was a high embankment on one side. We always worried about that embankment. Well, the last time I went by that embankment, I knew why I was worried, because we got our Jeep window shot out. And both the driver, who was a specialist, Lyles, and myself, we got out of there unharmed, but we were shaking, let me tell you. That was scary, especially because I was going home in 6 days.
Was that your first tour? Or your
That was
second
my
tour?
first tour. This was all doing my first tour. And I guess I forgot to say, but I was a captain at the time, obviously being a company commander, that's what you would be.
Right.
While I was there, I was pleasantly surprised in June to learn that I was on the list to be promoted to major.
Okay.
So upon returning to home, everything was fine the first time because the war demonstrators really hadn't gotten started yet. So I returned home, and it was assigned to Fort Lee again. It seemed like I was always going to Fort Lee. But Fort Lee told us, we don't have any housing available for you because you're just returning. I said, we've been gone for a year in Vietnam, and now you're telling me there's no housing, so don't bring my family? I said, you're crazy. You know, I'm bringing my family. At that time, we had 4 children. And so, you know, I wasn't leaving my wife and family there. One of the things that I believe was on the questionnaire that I didn't answer was, how did we communicate with our people back home? The only way you could communicate was by correspondence, letter. You could send a telegraph maybe, but you know, that was from Camron Bay, that was almost impossible. You had to go to Saigon, and maybe you could do it from there. And I never did. I always just relied on the letters, which is something I did forget. I had to make numerous trips to Saigon. I was down there at least once a month because I had troops down there,
Right.
and there was other matters that they would call me in on, you know, at the headquarters, at the First Logistics Command. So anyway, on one occasion, early in the year, I had been down there and met one of my friends that I had known from Fort Bragg, who had also been was stationed there in Saigon. And I told him that I didn't know if I'd be able to get a flight out or not, and if I didn't, could I stay with him? He said, sure. So unfortunately, I had a little time, so I finished a letter to my wife and mailed it, and mentioned that in the letter, that, oh, I was probably going to stay with Lieutenant or Captain so-and-so, and I told him the location. That night, as it turned out, I did get a flight out at the last minute, so I did get back to Camron. But that night, that BOQ they attacked it and blew off the side of it. And quite a few people were killed. My friend was not, he was in a different portion. But here my wife gets this letter.
Right.
I mean, she reads in the news, and the delay in mail was at least 2 to 3 days, she said, if I'd mail it from Saigon or mail it from Camron. Because Camron, they only came up 2-3 times a week with the mail, and of course Saigon was every day. So my wife is reading this, and she hadn't heard from me for a while, and she gets this letter, and she reads it and says, oh my God, and then she doesn't hear from me for a while, and she's worried sick. Of course, I don't know all this.
Right.
Finally, I get a letter from her telling me this, and so I then decided never again would I mail a letter in Saigon. They were all going to go out of Camron
Oh.
after the fact, because I didn't want to scare her anymore. So that pretty much completes my first tour. Are there anything that you...
No, it sounds as if you enjoyed your military career, and
Yeah, I enjoyed it because you're trained to do something, and you never get to do it for the most part. Particularly if you're in logistics, you just never do it. And finally, we got to Vietnam, and we got to see, can we really do what we've been training to do? And the answer was yes, we could.
and you took a lot of initiative, I see, even though quartermaster was your thing, you also had maintenance, and then you had things you had to do in Saigon and everything.
Right.
Yeah. So
Quartermaster, but quartermaster at that time did include maintenance, and that's what we were doing.
Oh, it did, or it did?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we were doing quartermaster maintenance items.
Mm-hmm.
So
How
after,
do you feel that wartime experience affected your veterans' life?
it made me much more aware of that life can end in a heartbeat. Keep yourself ready, you know, spiritually for whatever may occur. And my second tour in Vietnam, which we haven't talked about yet, even had a greater impact on me. Should I go ahead now with that? Okay, my second tour in Vietnam, after the first tour, I returned to the States, and after 2 years was sent to Thailand as an advisor in Korat, Thailand. Stayed there about 6 months, returned home because of my wife's illness. A year later, I was sent back to Thailand again to a place called Kanchanaburi, which is the site of the bridge on the River Kwai, the movie, which is actually true. There was a bridge, and I did see what was remains of it before they blew it up. So all that was true. And after that, I returned back to the States, and both the Thailand tours were without family. So I had been to Vietnam, Thailand twice, and now they told me, guess what, Frank, you're going back to Vietnam. I said, you can go Korea or Vietnam. I'm sorry. They did give me an option. I said, if I got to go, I want to go to Vietnam, because Korea, it's just, the time will pass too slow. You know, in Vietnam, you work 12 hours a day, so time just flies. And one day just runs into another, and you don't know 1 week from the next week. So my second tour was very interesting. We flew over there in, I think it was the 1st or 2nd of March, 1972. And we landed at an air base outside of Saigon called Ben Hoa. And no sooner had we got on the bus going to where we were supposed to process in, that the bus comes under fire and gets hit 2 or 3 shots on the bus. So we dive out of the bus and into the ditch. We got no weapons, no nothing, you know, because we haven't even processed in yet. But that turned out to be nothing, so we processed in. And while I was processing in, interesting enough, I met my best man from my wedding in Germany, who I hadn't seen since we had both left Germany in 1963. He was processing out. He was an engineer. He was processing out, and I was processing in. So we had a few minutes to meet, and that was interesting thing. Anyway, I was assigned to MACV headquarters, which Military Assistance Command Vietnam. That was the top headquarters in Vietnam. The commanding general at the time I got there was Creighton Abrams. My boss was a 2-star general by the name of Jack Fuson. And J4 has to do with logistics. My tour was kind of broken into 3 sections. The first part of my tour, I was the man responsible for making sure that the advisory team's logistics demands were being met, and to find any problems they had and to solve their logistics problems. I was also the manager, what they call the overseer, not really a manager, the overseer of the ordnance equipment, not quartermaster, the ordnance equipment that was being turned over to the South Vietnamese. And that was, since it was ordnance, that was just principally the South Vietnamese Army, which is called ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam. So I dealt some with the ARVN and then some with these advisors. That lasted about 4 or 5 months. Yeah, it was about July. Yeah, in July, they started this, what they call a situation report, which was a very detailed report of the status of the U.S. forces, the South Vietnamese forces, and the North Vietnamese forces. And this report was used by our general, first Abrams and then a General Wien replaced Abrams, to brief General Haig and Henry Kissinger as they went about the peace accords that they were working on. Now, this situation report was extremely detailed. For example, if I knew that an artillery unit, an ARVN artillery unit in somewhere out in the boondocks was missing a certain kind of round, ammunition round, I could go back and I'd tell you what ship it's on, when and where it's going to land, and who's going to transport it from there to that ARVN unit. I mean, that's the kind of detail we had. We knew the status of all their personnel forces, their equipment, what was deadlines for them, the parts that we needed to get for them to get them up to snuff. By this time, most U.S. combat units had left, so we were still had some advisory units. They were dwindling down as we continue to pull forces out, and so more and more it was the South Vietnamese that were doing the fighting, and we were in essence supporting them. That report was extremely interesting. The J3, which is quote operations, had overall responsibility for the report, and I had the second biggest portion. Well, the J3 guy had an emergency at home, and he had to go back to the States. Because time was of an essence, and I knew more about the report than anybody else, I was then detailed to J3 to continue to put this report together. So I put the last 3 of them together, and I was responsible for them. Being responsible, I had to sit in a rear view projection room during the presentations that General Wee and company were making. So I heard what was being said. And all I can say about that is, to the U.S. public, things were said and things were decided on that you've never read about, and you've never heard about. And it changed my perception forever about the United States government and how well I will trust what the U.S. government promises, because unfortunately many of them are empty. And if there's a bitterness about that war, that's what it is. Because that was terrible. Okay, the final part of my tour, which is probably the most challenging of all, was once we knew, and we knew this in early December, late November, that the peace accords were going to happen, and they were going to happen fairly quickly. The agreement was going to say something to the extent that whatever amount of equipment and supplies that the South Vietnamese armed forces had on the day of that ceasefire went into effect, that's the quantity that we, the United States, could maintain for them. In other words, if they lost a tank, we could replace a tank. If they lost 5 tons of ammunition, we could replace 5 tons of ammunition. Not 6, 5. And both forces were to agree with that. So my job was to work with primarily the ARVN, the Army of Republic of Vietnam, and determine what shortages they had in their units. Number one, so figure out what they need, then find out where it was, if it was in country with a U.S. unit, maybe it was still there, or find the source for it in the United States and get it into Vietnam no later than whenever that ceasefire was. And what was interesting here was the U.S. unit's helicopters was one of the interesting ones, because the U.S. unit helicopter units were still there, and the ARVN were going to take those helicopters, actually what they call the VNAF, the Air Force in Vietnam was going to take the helicopters. So we had to get the title of those helicopters transferred to the South Vietnamese before the date of the ceasefire, but that was going to be before the U.S. forces left. So we did a title transfer. It's like me taking the title of my car, transferring it to you, but I get to keep the car until some later date which is when, basically that later date would be whenever the U.S. forces were departing and no longer needed the helicopter. So we title transferred this. So I had to coordinate getting the Vietnamese and the unit owning the property, and let's say the helicopter guys, to meet, transfer the title, show whatever was wrong with the particular helicopter involved. If there was damage, we had to record that, and then agree upon a site where we'll actually make the physical turnover. Now, the physical turnover could happen after ceasefire, because it's already South Vietnamese property. That was the key, that it had to be South Vietnamese property on the day that the ceasefire went into effect, which was, I believe, the 30th of January in 1973. So some interesting things happened there as well. First of all, these advisory teams had been being drawn down. Some of those advisory teams had been very, very large, up to 100 in size. And by now they were down to 10, 15 guys. And we told everybody you had to turn in all your weapons. You have to account for every weapon you have. Well, you're only allowed one weapon generally per man. And these guys had hundreds in some cases of weapons, and they were 15 of them. So I want to send this message out. Well, the MP stopped it and said, no, you can't do that. They're not authorized these weapons. We're going to have to punish them if they turn them in. I said, that's ludicrous. That's nuts. So we went to the chief of staff, who was a 2-star, General Woodward. And General Woodward sided with me, then a major, over a brigadier general.
Okay.
And I won, thankfully, because it only made just common sense. So we did get all these weapons turned in. As a result, there were so many weapons out there that we didn't know about, that instead of bringing in small arms, machine guns and rifles and the like from the United States to give to the Vietnamese, we had to ship stuff out. We filled all their needs and shipped stuff out, not bring it in, which is what we thought we were going to have to do. So a couple other things is, it came one day to me, this was 2 days before the ceasefire was going into effect. And this guy comes into me and he says, I got some secret equipment, radio equipment that I have to transfer to the Vietnamese. I said, fine. What is it? Well, I can't tell you. I said, I'm cleared for top secret, but I can't tell you. I said, do the Vietnamese know what it is? Yeah.
Oh.
I said, look, I can't transfer a blank piece of paper. You're going to have to tell me what it is I'm transferring, so that if the North Vietnamese see it later, they'll be able to identify whatever it is you just said you transferred. And so finally, after a day, he came back and said, okay, I'll tell you. I said, thank you. How can you transfer a blank piece of paper? It doesn't mean anything. The other thing happened, and this actually happened after the fact. I get this frantic call from the guys down in Vung Tau, which was a little port there near Saigon, and said, we got some water equipment here, some tugs and some barges that have to be transferred to the South Vietnamese Navy. And I said, well, you know what's going on, don't you? And he says, yes. I said, look, I can't talk to you on this phone. You're going to have to come up here, because I was not going to discuss that kind of stuff over the phone. Make a long story short, it was after the fact, okay? So I wasn't really supposed to transfer it, but I had backdated some stuff and had some holes so I could backfill. Being an experienced logistician, you sometimes know that you got to cover yourself a little bit. So I was able to transfer the stuff. Well, no sooner did I transfer it than they tell me, oh, this stuff doesn't belong to the U.S. Army. It belongs to XYZ Corporation that were over here as contractors, and they left back 6 months ago and told the Transportation Corps that they would sell them for, it was a minimal price, and that the Transportation Corps was supposed to pay them, but they didn't. And so you mean to tell me I just transferred it, John Smith's vehicle, tugboat, to the South Vietnamese, of which I have no ownership, you have no ownership, and it's theirs, but I just gave it to the Vietnamese. You can't do that. So that particular thing kept me in country an additional 2 weeks. I finally got out of country 5 days before we all had to be gone. Because of that, I had finally got approval, and that took four letters from the generals to get those people back in the United States to understand. Because we told them what they had to do. We said, you got to pay the contractor for this equipment. And said, we've already transferred it. They said, well, you can't transfer it yet. And I said, well, you just listen to what we said. We have done the following. And you are to pay the guy like you were supposed to have done 3 months ago. And they came back, we can't, you don't understand, we can't do that. I said, yes, you can. And they kept telling me I can't transfer it. I said, you don't read real well. So we got the generals involved, I said, and the general told them more bluntly than even I did that, look, you idiot, it's already been done. All you got to do is pay the guy. So they finally paid him, and that paid off. Now, as far as my return to from Vietnam, by that time the demonstrators were kind of not out of control, and we were told when we flew in to San Francisco to change into civilian clothes or something and catch our flight back to, in my case, I was going to Richmond because my family was in Petersburg, Virginia. That was kind of a farce because they could identify us immediately because we all were suntanned because we'd been, you know, in Vietnam and it was March. And here we come back with this deep suntan, and most of the country didn't have a suntan in March. So, and I might add that during that same time, my wife had received several calls from the demonstrators, you know, threatening type calls. And here she was in the United States, 4 kids by herself, and she's getting these calls from these idiots, these demonstrators. She did call the telephone company, and it finally did cease, but it was still bad. So I guess my experience for Vietnam is the only bitterness is that I knew that the U.S. government didn't live up to their word, and I can never again trust politicians or what they tell me.
Peace with honor.
Yeah, well, that was it, yeah, because we had promised the Vietnamese, you know, that we were going to support them, and within 2 years later, we had sold them out. And I just finished reading this book, The Last Men Out, which was the Marines coming off the top of the embassy. I don't know if you've read the book, but if you do, it's pretty good.
I guess the last question was a lesson learned from the military service. Have you taken it on into your?
Yeah. I guess what I learned is that if there's an issue that you're strong on, be a leader. Go out and do it. I've been involved with different organizations since I've been out. I've been president of a PTA. I've been president of actually organized and was president of a group up in Herndon, Virginia, called Community Against Substance Abuse, working along with, at that time, Nancy Reagan in the Just Say No program. We involved 7 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, and a high school in this program, and did actually reduce the use of drugs during that period. Since I've come down here, I've gotten the things I enjoy much more. I'm president of been president of the University of Alabama Baldwin County chapter of the alumni. I'm currently president of the Red Elephant Club, which is a booster club for the University of Alabama. I'm still the scholarship chairman for the alumni group. We gave up $31,000 worth of scholarships to Baldwin County students this year. Okay. So all that kind of stuff I love doing. Okay. So the military stuff is kind of behind me now, but you use those lessons. Loyalty has got to be one. You know, you got to be loyal to your people. And I just treasure the people that I met while I was there. You know, and long life friendships. I mentioned earlier my first sergeant, Lester Vance. Unfortunately, he contacted, I guess it was colon cancer, shortly before we left Vietnam. And by the time I got back in September, he had already died. And he was one of the closest people I've ever met. And another one is a Master Sergeant Sheldon Christian, who lives in Widener, Georgia. He and I are real close. I was really closer to those two than I was to any officer I ever worked with. Although I was close to a lot of the officers, not as close as those two. Probably because I worked so closely with them for so long.
Okay, thank you.
So.
Okay, that sounds like we've covered everything. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I hope I didn't forget
That was
anything.
quite
I had my
interesting,
notes here and I never.
Frank, that was a very interesting history.
was.
It really
It was.
and truly was. It's so nice to know all of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes.